There are times in life when we feel like we are going through storms that we cannot understand why. There are moments when we are faced with suffering, loss, and seemingly insurmountable challenges. And in those moments, a Bible verse can bring us comfort and hope. And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are the called according to His purpose. Romans 8:28. This verse is not simply a promise, but a powerful statement about how God uses every situation in our lives to accomplish a greater purpose. We easily understand that good things, joys, and successes are gifts from God. But can we recognize that even trials, sufferings, and unwanted things can work for our good? When we face hardship, we often ask, "Why is this happening to me? Does God still care about me?" But it is in these times that our faith is tested. We are called to trust God not only when things are going well, but also when life is full of uncertainty. God does not promise that we will not have hardships, but He does promise that He will be with us in every situation, and that all things, both the good and the bad, are used by Him to accomplish a good plan for our lives. Sometimes, we cannot see the big picture while we are in pain, but in time, when we look back, we can clearly see that God used those difficult experiences to sharpen our faith and patience, to bring us closer to Him. It is in our trials that God helps us grow and become stronger. Every event in life, whether it is joyful or painful, has a purpose, a divine plan that we cannot yet fully understand. So when you face difficulties in life, remember that you are not alone. God is working in you, even when you cannot see it. Trust Him, because all things work together for good for those who love Him. God is the Creator, and He knows better than anyone how to use every situation in our lives to lead us to a wonderful purpose that He has planned for us. When we face challenges in life, it can sometimes be extremely difficult to maintain faith in God's promises, especially when faced with suffering, loss, or incomprehensible situations. It's easy to feel abandoned or lost in a world where everything seems to be falling apart. In those moments, believing that all things work together for good to those who love God can feel like empty words. When suffering is overwhelming, it can often be difficult to see the purpose behind any trial. It's a very human feeling. When we're struggling, our minds often search for answers, rationalizations, and we want to understand why we're suffering. Why am I facing this? Where was God when I needed Him most? These questions can arise in anyone's mind, and sometimes we feel that God's promises are just theories that cannot be applied to our real lives. When things don't go according to plan, and the world around us seems to be falling apart, it's easy to fall into doubt. This is a real test of faith. It's not always easy to believe that everything, both joy and sorrow, has a good purpose in God's plan. When faced with uncertainty, helplessness, and pain, our faith can falter. That's when faith becomes a choice, not a natural feeling. Faith doesn't always come easily, especially when we can't see immediate results or when there's no clear assurance about the future. But it is in these times that God invites us to put our trust in Him, not in what we can see, but in His promises. Romans 8:28 reminds us that no matter how difficult our current circumstances may be, God is working for good in our lives. It can be a comforting word in difficult times, reminding us that He has not abandoned us. Even in the midst of suffering or uncertainty, we can trust that God is leading us and using those trials to perfect us, to mature and strengthen us. It is important that we learn to trust in God's promises, not just when things are going well, but also when we are facing the storms of life. Faith is not easy, but it is in the difficult times that it becomes the key to finding peace and hope in God. When we can't see the path ahead, that's when we need to learn to trust in the One who made the path. When faced with trials and difficulties in life, we often long for clear explanations from God. We want to understand why we suffer, why a door closes when we thought it was our opportunity. But one thing we need to understand is that while God doesn't always give us detailed answers about everything, He does give us something much more important: His presence and His unchanging promises. God's presence is a priceless gift. While He cannot explain all the hardships we go through, when we call upon Him, He is always there to comfort, to soothe, and to guide us through the dark valleys of life. In the moments when we feel alone and lost, when everything seems to be falling apart, His presence is the only source of strength to keep us standing. God doesn't promise that we will never have trouble, but He does promise that He will never leave us alone. When we look at the stories in the Bible, we see clearly that God is always with the faithful, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Think of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. They didn't know how to escape Pharaoh's army that was pursuing them, but God made a way for them and led them through the sea. It wasn't because they understood everything, but because they trusted His presence throughout the journey. They weren't walking alone. God was with them every step of the way, protecting and guiding them. Faith isn't about knowing everything. Sometimes it's about accepting that we don't have to understand everything. We just have to trust that God is there and that He will lead us to the best place. God doesn't always give us the answers right away, but He does give us His presence in every situation. This is a great promise, an assurance that we do not have to face this life alone. Even when we walk through the darkest nights, even when we face challenges that seem insurmountable, God is always there, watching over us, guiding us every step of the way. His presence is what brings peace of mind, a sure faith that even though things may not turn out the way we expect, God is still working in us. His promise never changes. I will not leave you alone. So even when we don't understand everything, we can rest in the knowledge that God has not abandoned us. We never have to walk alone. Life is not always easy, even for those who pursue righteousness. In fact, in Psalm 34-19, we are reminded that many are the troubles of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. This is an important reminder that even if we live an honest life, pursuing righteousness, we will still face trials, suffering, and difficult times in life. But even though life may bring us storms and trials, our hope is not in avoiding hardship, but in trusting that God will deliver us. This does not mean that we will not experience difficult times. No one is exempt from life's trials. Whether it is loss, illness, or failure, life can leave us feeling exhausted and confused. And in times like these, it's easy to feel like we've been abandoned, that God's promises don't seem to make sense. Yet it's in these moments that we need to remind ourselves of the promise in Psalm 34-19, that God will deliver us, even if not in the time or way we want. One of the hardest things about faith is waiting. We often want answers right away. We want to see God's plan come to fruition right now, in the way we think is best. But faith teaches us that God doesn't always solve our problems on our own timetable. He has His own time and way, and sometimes His timing is different than what we expect. God doesn't abandon us, but He has a perfect plan, and sometimes He wants us to grow in the time we wait. Even though we may not immediately understand the reason, God's promise stands firm. The Lord will deliver us. That is a solid promise we can cling to in times of trouble. When we feel like we can't take it anymore, God will come at just the right time. Not always when we expect it, but at the time that God knows is best for us. His timing is not our timing, but it is perfect timing in His eyes. This promise is not only a comfort, but also a reminder to be patient and to trust in God's wisdom. We may not always see the big picture right away, but we can trust that God is at work, even when we don't. God will not abandon us. Even though we will have difficulties, our hope is in His salvation, at just the right time and in just the right way, according to His perfect plan. So whether you are in a time of trial or difficulty, remember that the promise of Psalm 34:19 still holds true. The Lord will deliver you. Trust in His timely salvation. And remember that He is always with you, even in the moments when you feel weakest. God is never late. Life doesn't always go according to the plan we've set. Sometimes, we try to create a perfect plan, hoping that everything will unfold as we desire. But then everything falls apart. Or we find ourselves in unforeseen circumstances. In these moments, it's easy to feel helpless and confused, wondering if any of it makes sense and whether God is really working in our lives. But it is during these times that our faith is tested, and that's when we need to trust in God's plan, even when we can't understand everything right away. It's hard to believe that God is at work when we don't see immediate results. We may feel like our lives are being interrupted, or that we are walking down a dark path with no idea of where it leads. We want answers right now, and we want things to go according to our expectations. However, what faith teaches us is that even when we don't understand everything, we must still believe that God is working, even when we can't see the results clearly. God never gives up on His plan for us. Even in the toughest moments, He is working quietly, slowly, and perfectly. What we call a delay is not a failure. It's an opportunity for God to work in our lives in the best way possible. We can't see the whole picture right now, but God can. He sees the future, and He knows what is best for us, even if we are not ready or don't fully understand that plan. When we can't understand why things are happening the way they are, it's important not to lose faith in God's plan. God never works without reason, and everything He does is for our benefit. It is in these uncertain times that faith helps us remember that we are not the ones in control of our lives. God is the Creator, and He has a perfect plan for our lives. So, when life doesn't seem to follow our plan, remember that God is still at work. Trust that He is leading us to better places, even when we can't see it right now. In times of challenge, we must hold firm to our faith in God's wisdom and guidance, knowing He will never abandon us and that He will work to bring good into our lives, even if we don't understand it immediately. Faith is one of the central values in the life of a believer, but it's not always easy to practice, especially when life doesn't go according to our plans, or when we face difficult circumstances that are beyond our understanding. When everything around us seems chaotic, and when we can't see the results of our efforts, the call to live by faith becomes clearer than ever. Faith is not just believing in what we can see or understand. In fact, faith is living not by sight, but by the promises of God. When we look at the world around us and the challenges in life, it's easy to get caught up in trying to explain everything. We want to understand why things happen the way they do, and we long for a clear plan, a detailed blueprint, so we can feel secure and safe. However, what God invites us to do is to live not by what we see and understand, but by His promises. He has promised that everything in our lives, whether joyful or painful, will work together for good for those who love Him. And that promise is the solid foundation on which we live by faith. This means that sometimes we won't understand everything right away. Difficult circumstances, suffering, and unexpected events will come into our lives. But faith teaches us that we don't always have to understand or explain everything. Faith is trusting in God even when there's no immediate answer, and it's the belief that He is working in our lives, even when we don't see it clearly. Faith is choosing to trust in God's promises, not in what we feel or see. The call to live by faith is also a call for us to let go of control and instead entrust our lives to God. We are not the ones in charge of everything. While we may want to understand it all, faith is an invitation to stop trying to explain everything and, instead, trust in the Creator, who knows our future better than anyone. When we face difficult times, remember that faith is not living based on what we see, but living based on what God has promised. His promises are eternal truth, and if we live by those promises, we will not only find peace in difficult times, but also feel His loving presence in every step we take. Faith is the belief that God will complete the work He has begun in our lives, even when we can't see how He is working. So, don't just try to explain everything. Trust in God, trust in His promises, and live each day with a firm faith that He will lead us through every challenge, even when we don't understand why. In our journey of faith, one of the greatest challenges is how we measure the goodness of God. Many times, we assess His goodness based on comfort and ease in life. We want to see peace, prosperity, and a life free from challenges or suffering. But the reality is that God never promised our lives would always be easy. Instead of seeking comfort, we need to learn to recognize that God always has a higher purpose in every circumstance, even when those circumstances cause us pain or hardship. Facing challenges and suffering is something no one wants to experience. When things don't go as planned, when we face loss, illness, or delays in our prayers, it's easy to feel confused and discouraged. In those moments, we often ask, why is God letting me go through this? How can I see His goodness when life is so full of pain? However, it's important to remember that God's goodness doesn't always manifest through the comfort and happiness we desire. In fact, many times God works in us through difficulties and challenges. Sometimes, painful experiences are the means He uses to teach us, to refine our faith, and to help us grow stronger in our belief. Pain can be a tool that God uses to shape us, to clarify our patience and dependence on Him, and to help us see values we might not recognize when everything is easy. When we go through tough times, we may not immediately see God's greater purpose in them. However, faith teaches us that God never overlooks the pain we endure. He always has a purpose, a bigger and better plan, which we may not understand right now. Sometimes, it is in the darkest moments that God is working most profoundly within us. The difficulties are not signs of God's absence, but rather opportunities for Him to perfect us, to help us become reflections of His love and greatness. Therefore, instead of measuring God's goodness by comfort and lack of trials, let's learn to see every circumstance in life as part of the perfect plan He has for us. Even when there is pain, we can trust that God is working for our good, because He loves us and always wants us to grow to become more like Him. Let's hold fast to faith in God's greater purpose, even when we can't see it right now. Prayer is not only about talking to God. It's also about surrendering all our worries, difficulties, and doubts into His hands. In times of trial, when life doesn't go as expected, prayer becomes the key that helps us maintain our faith and turn to God with the trust that He will always guide us through every hardship. Faith is not a natural state we easily achieve, but rather a continuous journey that we must nurture and strengthen each day, especially in times of great trials. When facing difficult moments, prayer helps us surrender everything to God, accepting that we cannot control everything on our own. Faith is trusting in God's promises even when we can't see how He is working. God's promises are something we can hold on to, even when everything around us seems chaotic and uncertain. God doesn't promise that our lives will always be easy, but He promises that He will always be with us, that He will never forsake us. Prayer is where we find the strength to live by faith, even when it feels difficult. It is where we can ask God to give us the strength not just to endure the trial, but to grow through it. Prayer is an opportunity for us to open our hearts to God, so He can work in us, giving us patience and understanding of. Rather than just calling on God to free us from hardship, prayer is also where we ask Him to help us understand the purpose He has through that trial. In prayer, we don't just ask God to calm the storm we are facing, but we also ask Him to help us learn and grow from these challenges. Faith is an ongoing process, and sometimes the trial itself is the tool God uses to help us develop. Prayer helps us hold fast to our trust in Him, not because we understand everything, but because we believe He has a good plan for each of us. Trials are not signs of a lack of faith, but rather opportunities for us to grow stronger in our faith, to learn to surrender fully to Him. We pray for God to give us the strength to live by faith, to trust in His promises, not because of favorable circumstances, but because we believe He is always working for our good. We also pray for the trials to help us grow, so that we not only survive hardship but also become stronger, closer to God, and more mature in faith. We ask God to open the eyes of our hearts so we can see His work even in the midst of trials and difficulties. In this way, we can keep moving forward, always trusting in Him, no matter how challenging life may be. Prayer is the connection between us and God, a place where we can find peace in our hearts and completely surrender to His power and unconditional love. One of the hardest things we can do on our faith journey is to completely surrender everything to God. Surrender is not an easy act, especially when our lives are filled with worries and uncertainties. However, when we truly believe in God's power and surrender all things to Him, we allow Him to complete the good work in our lives. It is in those moments when we cannot control everything that complete surrender becomes the key for us to see the greatness and perfection in His plan. Surrender means giving up control, trusting that even though we don't understand everything, God is still working in our lives. God is not only concerned with the successes and good things we desire. He cares about the process, about how we grow through each trial, and how we learn to depend completely on Him. In fact, in the moments when we feel the weakest, when everything seems to go wrong, that's when we need to surrender to God the most. Faith is not just believing in God when everything is going smoothly, but trusting in Him when we cannot see the immediate results. Surrender is the choice to trust in His power and love, knowing that He will work for good in our lives, even when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are. Surrender does not mean inaction, but rather entrusting the outcomes to God, trusting that He will lead us to the best possible place. An important part of surrender is trust in God's sovereignty. He is the one who knows all things, the one with infinite power and wisdom. When we surrender to Him, we acknowledge that He knows better than anyone what we need and the best way for us to grow. God's power is not only shown in resolving difficulties immediately, but in the process of teaching and perfecting us. Every trial, every pain we go through could be an essential part of the beautiful plan He has for us. The only way God can complete the good work in our lives is when we are willing to let go, stop trying to control everything, and surrender to Him. We may not understand why things are happening the way they are, but faith teaches us that He will never let us suffer in vain. He always has a purpose, and that purpose is good because He is the one who loves us. So, surrender everything to God. Trust in His infinite power, and allow Him to complete His good work in your life. No matter how difficult things may seem, trust that God is working, and He will lead you to a future more beautiful than you can imagine. This complete surrender is not a sign of weakness, but a manifestation of strong faith, a belief that He will always finish what He has started in your life. When a prayer comes to an end, that is the moment we truly surrender everything into God's hands. We offer Him our time, the outcomes, and all the questions we cannot answer on our own. Every time we pray, it is an opportunity for us to acknowledge that not everything is within our control, and the only thing we can do is place our trust in God's guidance. Surrendering does not mean ceasing to act or not caring about the results. It means trusting that the final outcome will be good, even if we cannot see it immediately. When we surrender time to God, we accept that He will work according to His timing, not on our schedule. Even though this may make us feel uncertain or uneasy, we trust that His guidance is perfect. The closing prayer is an invitation to focus on faith and growth through each challenge. Instead of merely seeking immediate answers, we learn to rest our minds and hearts in the peace that God provides. Challenges may not be what we desire, but they are opportunities for us to grow deeper in faith, to understand more of His greatness, and to experience His presence in every circumstance. With every question, every worry, and every challenge, surrender them all to God, trust in His guidance, and allow your faith to mature through those trials.